Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noreen Durrani, and welcome to this CARCEIT seminar. Apologies for the slightly late delay due to room overbooking. Today, we are delighted to introduce you to Tom Kral, who will be talking today about issues of identity, the entanglement of identity, complexities of language, identity empowerment, and implications for decolonization, focusing on India. So we are moving out of Central Asia, not too far away though, quite close neighbors. India. Over to you, Tom. Tom, by the way, is a postgraduate researcher currently completing his PhD at the University of Lancaster in the UK. Over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Noreen, and thank you, Katya, and thank you to all of you for coming and for inviting me to speak today and to present my research. I'm really excited to share some of my work that I have done in India. So yes, so I'm just going to give you some background. So why am I in Kazakhstan? I'm from the University of Lancaster as a postgraduate PhD researcher. So I'm here in Astana because my wife works for the CPS, the continuing preparatory. she's a language teacher and she just started this year, and I'm here as a dependent. So that's what brings me here. And why did I do my research in India? Well, I was also a dependent going to India with her. She had a fellowship, and the fellowship was based in South India. So just as my original plan was to do my research in Sri Lanka, where I had lived and I had worked and I had done lots of different things, but I wasn't able to do that. So I was forced actually to do my PhD thesis research in India, in South India, at a women's college where my wife was teaching, was based with a fellowship. So why English? Well, my background a little bit, just to position myself within the research. I'm a lifelong English teacher. I started teaching 25 to 28 years ago. Then I became a teacher trainer, and then I became a project manager. I worked for the British Council, working on development and teacher training projects in different countries, especially in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And then to kind of go along with why agency, why disempowerment, why decolonization. As I worked in different countries, I noticed that my work wasn't just, oh great, I'm here teaching people English. There is a power issue involved in my work. There's a coloniality involved in my work. English plays a colonial role especially in countries like India, which are former British colonies and which have a colonial legacy. So I also noticed that communities were sometimes empowered, sometimes disempowered, and I noticed that English was often the language of the elite and not of everyday people. And so I had interactions with both types of communities, or with all types of communities. And so it became increasingly clear to me that I wanted to kind of find out more about this. And so I went to India to accompany my wife on her project. So I just included a map, just what Noreen was saying, to kind of situate ourselves with Astana here and South India here, where I was based for my research. Okay, so I'll give you some background on the debates over global English for those of you who aren't so familiar with it. So there are kind of three. I divided the key literature into three big debates, and the first one is kind of the linguistic imperialism kind of idea or scholarship, and this labels English as colonial and neo-colonial. So in the modern sense, it continues its colonial legacy from the power of the United States and globalized English as part of soft power for not only the United Kingdom, the US, but also for the Western world. as kind of a global lingua franca, which brings an ideology with it, including an epistemology and ontology and ways of being and ways of learning and all of that. Okay, so that's one school of discussion. Another one is a little bit different than that. English is kind of a global, malleable, flexible lingua franca. So this here we find out that English actually is spoken as a non-native language far more than as a native language. So there are many more people in countries like Kazakhstan and in countries like India around the world where it is not a first language. It is a second, third, or fourth language. And there are something like 1.5 billion speakers of English who are not native speakers. And maybe only about 400 or 500 million who are native speakers. So the balance of power then changes, and this has implications. The ownership of English no longer is in Buckingham Palace or in, kind of in the UK, but or in the US, but it's there's an Indian English, there's Singaporean English, there are localized versions of English, and people bring their own cultures and ideas into English, their own languages which mix with English. So this is so then English can almost be used as a language to resist the colonialism of English in the first place. That's a second school of thought. Then the third one brings in, it's a more recent kind of area of scholarship. And this one is it brings in the neoliberal paradigm, and basically the idea that English has risen with the rise of global capitalism and then neoliberalism, the fact that our lives are becoming more monetized, individualized, success is individualized, competition is forced upon us in all of our academic lives and so on, in our work lives, and English is part of that equation. And so the people who subscribe to this school of thought are thinking, well, okay, yes, English is a malleable lingua franca, but it's not equal. There are unequal Englishes. The way that English is spoken by native speakers is still the way that people want to learn, because they want to be part of that powerful community of the kind of the elite, metropolitan elite in different countries where English is used to the standard that native speakers would want to, and very well-educated, fluent native speakers. So those are the three debates on global English. In India, the tensions are kind of similar, but specific to India. So the consensus, it's not a consensus, but it's a dominant view. But English in India advantages some people, but it disadvantages most. And by English, I don't mean the language itself, but English as a medium of instruction, which is becoming increasingly popular, not only in higher education where it's standard, but in primary schools and secondary schools as well. The problem is, in some of the lower tier schools, even the teachers don't really speak English that well, but they're sold as private English medium schools. Parents are excited. They want their children to succeed with English, but the outcomes are not very good. And this creates a divide. So, yeah, so as another scholar says, for the vast majority of Indian students, English promises much, but delivers little. English has become a source of social division, exclusion, and thereby undermines the social justice agenda of education in the Indian democracy. Okay, so that's one view, but there's a counter view as well. And there's one scholar in particular who shares this, but she's not alone. So she says that the spread of English in India has indigenous agency and voice. So she disagrees. She says it's not a colonial language, it's a decolonial language. It fights against coloniality. We can bring in our own values. And she says it's a tool of decolonization in the hands of subaltern communities and can help them access the global economy. So that's quite a tension. Like, so which one is it? What's going on here? Is it really a tool for decolonization for the most marginalized people in India? Well, okay, access to the global economy through things like call centers and, these sorts of businesses where English is needed. Okay, maybe. Right. So this is something called the Dalit goddess of English, and in North India or in North Central India, the Dalit community, and these are the most marginalized people in India's caste system, the untouchables, the lowest of the most marginalized communities. They have erected a temple dedicated to the English language, and they have created the goddess of English. And the Dalit community go there to worship, to pray that learning English will bring them good fortune. And so India is a religious country. Many people practice many different religions, and they attend the temple and hope for good wishes from the Dalit goddess of English. And it's not, and English then brings this hope, this promise, this aspiration. And I'll get to more student stories in a moment, but one of the students I spoke to kind of confirmed this. She said, in the past, poor people, they weren't allowed to talk in English, but at present, English is taking CARCEIT, I think. English is
communication.
Yeah, English is common to all of us. We are seeing so many farmers who are not educated, and they're saying, my children should not be like me. They need to be well educated. They need to get a good job. So Donica says they're keeping their children in English medium schools, but the English schools aren't really that great, and if they're getting a good education is highly debatable. So, but there's a lot of promise there. Okay, so this is one of the kind of social exclusions is based on social class and caste. The other one is a women's college, so it's about the status of women and gender injustice. This is actually a satirical poster. So it's a piece of satire. It's not a real poster, it's a mock poster. But posters like this are found in Indian classrooms of what a good boy and what a good girl should behave like. It sets the standards of behavior for what young boys and girls or young men and women should behave like. And and this is a mockery of one of those posters, and it positions English right here, if you notice. And so, a bad girl, roams around at 9 p.m. She wears the wrong clothes. She, goes to a disco, and then she talks in English. So talking in English, there's equated to all these other condemned behaviors that women of a certain social position should not be engaging in. And again, we think it's kind of a joke, but it is actually part of the public discourse. And what's interesting here is that it's also a mirror into what the resistance to that gender injustice is like. So there is pushback against all of this through satire like this, so which I found quite interesting. And again, I have one of the students I spoke to. She confirmed, and others did as well, but Samira told me most of the Indian women, they will get afraid to speak English because they thought that we are not fluent, we are not suitable to speak English, we are not suitable. Yeah? As me, I thought that as well starting, that we are not suitable. So yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack. And so here I am in India. I said, okay, there's a lot to learn here. This is not bad for my PhD research. So then it was time to write up some research questions to send to my supervisor. So yeah, I had 3 research questions. The overriding one was, how does English empower and disempower students at a non-elite English medium women's college in India? It was a decidedly not non-elite college. It was not in a metropolitan city. If you land in New Delhi or Mumbai or Hyderabad, people will speak English. If you land in smaller cities, people will generally not. There's a big gap between the metropolitan and the other parts of India. So, yeah, and good. Second research question, what are the most significant structural constraints which undermine the students' empowerment through English. Structural constraints are something from my theoretical framework, which I will share with you in a moment. But basically, it means what are the main barriers that these students face in being empowered by English. And the reason I chose empowerment as a key word was because the college actually had a course called English for Empowerment. And they had, for the college, empowerment through English was a big deal. It's an English medium college, but they wanted their students, some of who didn't speak English very well, but were in an English medium college, they wanted to empower them through English. Yeah? So it's kind of, that's what led me, what does that mean, empowerment, how? Empowerment in what way? Okay, and then the third research question, what changes to language, pedagogy, and practice could support the students' empowerment? So I wanted there to be some sort of solution, something that I could recommend to have a closure on this research. Okay, so those are my three research questions. So then the research context and the participants. What did I do? So as I said, it was a women's English medium college in a small city in South India. Small meaning, and by Indian standards, that was about 1.5 million people. So probably like Astana, but small by Indian city standards. 17 non-elite female final year BA and BSc students were the participants. So non-elite is kind of a vague word, but I'll get to it in a moment. It was a non-metropolitan context. They were from none of them were from the big cities. They were all they were from different parts of India, but not from the big metro cities. They were a mix of urban and rural from different communities. Most of them were the first in their families to attend higher education and to use English, to speak English. Not all of them. A few had parents, 3 or 4 had a parent who spoke English and was maybe a teacher or some kind of other professional. Most of them came from villages, and they were the first ones to engage with English and with higher education. They had a mix of first languages and English proficiency levels, but of course, the people who volunteered for my research were quite strong in English. I didn't use a translator or an interpreter. I did my own interviews. Yeah, I said college stresses English for empowerment as a principle, so that's kind of what led me to the wording of my research questions. Okay, my sampling was of course opportunistic, whoever agreed to take part in my research, and yeah, snowball sampling, their friends. Okay, so now I tried to make my data gathering quite interactive. I didn't want to just kind of, I was going to be there for more than 1 year, for a year and a half or so. I didn't want to I wasn't going to helicopter in and out to do my research. I wanted to become a member of the community, which I did, and I'll share in a second about that. But so the data gathering involves, first of all, narrative frames and interactive dialogic interviews, which are a little bit different than kind of regular semi-structured interviews. It was with participants that I knew, that I had developed a relationship with, and that we were able to have more of a discussion than simply just a question and answer. Like it was, I tried to make it less extractive. I tried to kind of follow a kind of a decolonial ethos, to not be the white guy who comes in and just asks a lot of questions and leads again. So I wanted to kind of immerse myself in the community as much as I could. I used photos and vignettes as well to back up the interactive interviews. These helped to create some sort of a space between them and myself as the researcher, to talk about more sensitive topics, which did come up, and it was actually a very useful way to do that, especially related to forced and arranged marriage and other things that, and some of their quite difficult histories which came up. Okay, the narrative frames, which I think were a key part of my research, my data gathering. I actually, because in India, English is written usually better than it is spoken. and the students are used to writing but not speaking. So in order to kind of facilitate the interview, I found this kind of writing data gathering technique called narrative frames. And they were quite useful because the students could write their own stories about their experience with English, their lived experience, and their future plans. So I would write sort of a starting point, and they would finish the sentence and put it in the form of the story. They would give this to me ahead of the interview, and then I would already have the basic information about them, and this would be kind of a springboard to more interactive interviews, more in-depth sort of discussions, because I already had a good idea of what they were about. So I thought that was an interesting way to manage the data gathering. Okay. As a white guy who shows up in India, it's not straightforward. I had to really be mindful of my positionality. So how my position in this, they've never had any European-looking people or any foreigners at all at this college. We were the first ones, and we showed up there as part of an agreement between universities, and so there I was as a dependent, as an accompanying spouse, with a huge colonial baggage. I was there with we're studying at a British university. Yeah, so it needed a lot of kind of my own reflexivity about the power imbalances involved in the structures that I would encounter as an outsider to the community. So I did some reading, and I said, and then I read this. Only insiders can properly represent a community. I said, oh my God, I'm an outsider. How can I represent this community? Outsider researchers disempowers insiders. So I don't want to do that. The outsider researcher is a social intruder. Oh no. And worst of all, the white researcher should stay at home. It's like, oh no, my PhD is destroyed. I can't do this. So, but then I did other reading, and there are actually there's quite a lot of literature that counters this, and so I got, and especially literature which counters the insider-outsider binary. Yeah, so people are never just outsiders and insiders. We kind of straddle this line between being on the inside and being on the outside. So of course, here's kind of the spectrum, yeah. So of course I'm white, I'm a European guy, I'm male, I'm a researcher. This makes me a clear outsider in the community, yeah. But I'm also a teacher, and the college has many teachers. So that's already a connection with the college, yeah. So I got to know some of the teachers in the English department. That was great. I volunteered at the college. I was offered a workshop, a weekly workshop with writing students. I got to know a group of students who really took an interest in my research. I told them all about it, and they said, yeah, we want to participate in your research. Sounds really interesting. So they agreed to participate in my research. I had colleagues. I became quite close to some of the colleagues. I was invited out to see the city, to do stuff around, to meals, to the cinema. I facilitated a clean camp. They had a cleanup they cleared all the plastic garbage from the campus, so I participated in that. I started taking photos at events, so I became just kind of a regular guy on the campus. Of course, still an outsider. I'm not Indian. I'm not a woman, but yeah, I went running on campus. Everyone kind of knew who I was. So I became kind of over time. I became not just a complete outsider who just showed up. I became kind of what researchers call an in-betweener. Yeah, I was kind of an in-betweener. I wasn't outside. I wasn't inside. I was kind of researching from kind of an in-between position. So which seemed okay. But there are also advantages of being a cultural outsider. Like the participants seem to be less. They weren't as worried about being judged. I was not within their social hierarchy, so they would tell me things that but they wouldn't maybe tell others as a local researcher. Yeah, I was able to ask questions that maybe a local researcher would think is a bit silly or unnecessary. I was able to maintain a critical distance. That the outsider status had me I could observe culture from that distance. I could observe things that others maybe couldn't. And I understood that my findings would be different than if a local research had done them, but equally valuable. And both perspectives are necessary. So I was reassured I don't have to go home anymore. I can continue on with my research. So all was great. Okay, so then I was thinking about my framework, and I know I want to make sure to get to my findings, so I'm mindful of the time, but something that I chose, something that was kind of consistent with a decolonial ethos and sort of my own journey as working in the field of international education development came from the capability approach, which is an approach that focuses on human development and human well-being. So it's a little bit different than the human capital approach we usually associate with education, which provides resources and looks for sort of outcomes with well-being, mostly economic well-being. That's what the focus is on. But the capability approach is a little bit different. Well-being is filtered in different ways. So we have the resource here was English education that I was looking at. Well-being is filtered by capabilities and functionings, and capabilities in the simplest way are what students are able to be and to do. Yeah? So it's not enough to have resources, like an English medium education is a great resource, potentially, but there have to be, it has to turn into a capability or functioning in terms of what students can do with it. Yeah? What are they able to do or be as a result of that education? And then they choose their capabilities to satisfy their well-being for a life they want to live, a life they have a reason to value. But this is also filtered by something called conversion factors. So that means they're outside forces. So personal, if they're women, they have a different experience than men as students. So, and their opportunities are different with English, as we've seen through the poster and the other stuff. Social, their level of their social status, environmental, how far they live from the school, if they have a long commute, they might miss studying opportunities, whatever, all sorts of factors are considered. And two things that influence those conversion factors are students' agency, and in a positive way, and structural constraints in a negative way. So social realities that constrain them, that limit them from pursuing those capabilities. So that's a very quick picture of quite a complex theoretical framework, but that was it. Okay, and I will skip this because that's way too much to process. But this is just this is the way I did my data analysis. I wasn't cherry picking the data you're about to see. I used a reflexive thematic analysis combined with an iterative process with my research questions and the capability approach, which I integrated into the process. So I could give a whole hour-long talk on this as well, so I won't do that today, but just to give you a very quick picture of it. Okay, so the kind of the findings I think are quite interesting, and this is where we get to the students' stories. Yeah, this is what they told me. So empowerment. So empowerment really, and within the theoretical framework, came in three kind of categories. And the first one, the most kind of basic one, was empowerment is neoliberal. Yeah? And this is kind of what was communicated with the college. And here, Aria, one of the participants, said, well, if I didn't know English, it would be very difficult to survive in the world. In order to compete in the mass competition, you're supposed to have good communication skills, and the first language is always English. In India, English makes all the difference. So it's really, they all said this, it's a jungle out there, it's competitive, not many jobs, lots of applicants, and you need to have English. And this gets back to the gender issues, the gender injustice. If a man doesn't, so Lila said to me, if a man doesn't know English, they will still hire the man for a job. If a woman doesn't know English, she will be rejected. And several students told me this. English skills mean a lot in a woman's life, in a professional or aspirational woman's life. So she really, for their careers, their futures, they felt English was indispensable, and good English, and a certain type of English even. So, and this was kind of what the university meant by empowerment, which is kind of the neoliberal version, human capital version, or whatever we want to call it, kind of to compete in our monetized lives. Okay, the next, yeah, and just to link it to a capability and the capability approach to aspiration from the literature. So kind of aspiration is quite linked to this empowerment as neoliberal. Okay, the second category was empowerment as socially liberal, and in this way, it moves a little bit away from the neoliberal kind of economic perspective and into kind of self-empowerment in other ways. So here, for example, here we get into the gender justice issue. So Chandra says here parents are forcing girls to get married. That was the case for a lot of graduating girls. Obviously, if they will be confident in their English, they can file a case against them, so they have legal rights. And she herself, she says, I'm very much empowered by this. So she's empowered by the fact that she may not have to agree to get married to somebody she doesn't want to marry, and that's hugely empowering. It means taking on her parents, especially her father, but she has that power if she can access the legal system, which remains in English. English is one of the languages of the courts. And this is quite an interesting story was told by, this is just a bit of a memory jog. So Layla was one of the participants, and her neighbor, she talked about her neighbor, and her neighbor was in an arranged marriage, and she was housebound. She had to live with her in-laws in an extended family, which is quite typical. And so she couldn't really leave the house. She was just kind of marginalized to the house, which isn't unusual, just to take care of the in-laws, take care of children, and so on. And she decided to start making YouTube videos. She learned English. She did well in English, and she started to make YouTube videos at home on phonics. And of course, India is quite a big market, and people from around the world started watching her videos, and she made a lot of money. And this is quite interesting. And so she says, so Layla tells me, my husband, and she quotes her neighbor, my husband's earning well, but his parents were not respecting me. If I'm earning a higher salary than him, they are respecting me. So if we're earning money independently, then all the people are respecting us. So it is very important. So English, okay, it made her financially independent, but more importantly to her, she was no longer disrespected by her in-laws. Her in-laws said, oh, hey, you're earning good money, you're out earning your husband, and they got mad at the husband or something. So it empowered this young woman to become more autonomous, to have autonomy in her life, and she was able to at least have a better relationship with her in-laws, so she got some power within the family unit. So it's quite, so that's kind of moving away from the neoliberal a little bit to the socially liberal, and this is where the capability approach kind of kicks in, let's say. Okay, so then we have the third category, which is empowerment is transformative, and that takes it to the next step. It's when empowerment leads to seeking societal change, yeah, seeking some sort of kind of change in how people look at the world. And so Gayatri told me English is very important to read and to analyze the conditions in different countries, what they're doing about women's atrocities, elsewhere, which are really rising in India. So gender-based violence is an issue everywhere in India. It's especially a significant issue. She says in some countries, the women at risk are reducing, are going down. What are the measures that they are taking? What are the policies? I want to know how the world is running. If we know English, if we speak to different people, including in our discussion, she gets knowledge this way. So she accesses the global discussion on gender-based violence, and she wants to work in the civil service and raise awareness about gender-based violence, and that's a passion of hers. So she wants to change her community, because oftentimes women accept the violence that they incur, and she wants to change that. She wants to change that and access that sort of knowledge in global discussions in English, which are not available in her language in Telugu. So that's kind of this takes it to the next step, kind of transformative way to empowerment. And this links to the capabilities of critical thinking and voice. So access to a situation where they can critically reflect on issues and then use their voice to improve society and to raise public awareness where they live. Okay. The next research questions were about the structural constraints, those barriers. And the big one here was English as a language of prestige, yeah? As social prestige of English, and it's a big issue. So Danica told me, because in here, sir, speaking in English is a matter of respect. People will see us in a high position. Ritika tells me English is everything, sir. It gives pride. People, they give respect. Okay. So it doesn't seem like a constraint now, but let's keep going. So Danica tells me, if we are talking in English, they think that we are showing off. So so if you speak English, it's like, oh wow, you speak English. Are you better than us? You're showing off. And several students said this. They were usually quite good in English and they wanted to practice with their friends. And the others on campus said, what's with you? Why are you speaking? Yeah. And they think it's a posh kind of thing to speak in English. Yeah? So it's a high society thing to use English. So this creates kind of a divide, the English haves and the have-nots. Yeah? So here's an interesting, this is one of my favorite stories that I heard from Samira. And she tells me when we are traveling on a motorbike with her brother, my brother, he used to talk to me in English, and she remembers this very fondly. What is interesting is all others at their destination, they should treat us like we are Americans, we are foreigners. You should speak to me in English, her brother said. And then I said, no, by seeing our faces, they will understand we are Andhra, we are local, you know? And this brings in kind of a racialized discourse almost, or, okay, so by presenting themselves, or social class discourse, because so they arrive by bike wearing Indian style clothes, and if they started speaking English, well, maybe they're showing off, or well, you shouldn't be speaking English, you're one of us, yeah? But if they showed up in an SUV and they were wearing Western clothes, they were from the city, from Hyderabad, and they would be speaking English quite naturally, quite usually, and nobody would say a thing. Yeah? So it's a social class divide. It's also slightly racialized. So this is a real constraint. People will avoid speaking English to not fall into those traps. So it's quite interesting. It's kind of a double-edged sword. So the prestige of English really came out as a structural constraint. And I just asked this, like, what would your life be without English? And Rita told me I wouldn't really know the world. I would only be, and DT says I would only be a frog in a well, thinking it's the world. I would be a dumb girl. I wouldn't be a complete person. Nothing would make me special from the others. My image would be spoiled, Chandra said, oh my God. But this has implications, because then there are some students on campus who really don't speak English very well. And then are they dumb girls? Are they, so the inverse is then for people who don't speak English. So it's a real divide, yeah, the haves and the have-nots. And this causes fear, yeah. speaking English is a culture of fear. Yeah, Nietzsche says, like, for the past 5 years, I have feared to talk in English. The others will make fun of me. I'll go into depression. It's very common. People start judging you on your grammatical mistakes. So they're looking for the perfect grammar, of course, Cambridge grammar or whatever, you know, the English from native speakers or the metropolitan elite. So it's a real issue. And of course, the patriarchal gaze, as one scholar calls it, is the third structural constraint, the gender issue. So Sanvi tells me if the girls learn English, maybe they have a chance to attend higher studies. Otherwise, the parents, they just want the qualification to print on the marriage certificate, on the marriage card, and that's all. Fathers often choose subjects the students study. Usually it's teaching, so they can easily move on to marriage when he decides it's the time. And this extends beyond the family to the community. Gowrie tells me we have 3 daughters in the family. My parents send us so far away from home and we are studying. Everyone in the village says, well, they're girls only now. Why are you making them study? They're like, why are you sending them to college? So this comes from the community, not only from the family. And it's what one scholar called the patriarchal gaze of society. Okay, so third question is what can we do about this? So my thinking was kind of emancipation from native speakerism, from what came out, because this native speaker standard is really very strong. So Chandra says, I want to speak just like you're speaking, like native speakers. I love the accent. I want to speak like them maybe in the future. But Deepthi says something more concerning. I have an inferior feeling that native speakers can't understand my accent. But she doesn't, it's not up to native speakers to understand. It's up to native speakers to understand her, not her responsibility. Yeah, she shifts the responsibility to herself. She shouldn't feel inferior, basically. And Ulani says something similar. She problematizes the fact that English is not her native language. That shouldn't be problematized. Most English speakers don't have English as their native language. I think this is an issue. So overall, the kind of the decolonizing English agenda that I propose is nurturing a language-supported ethos at the college, legitimizing translanguaging, which means mixing languages much more than is enabled, having more interactive teaching so students can ask more questions and interact more in classes, emancipating students from native speakerism, basically by not demanding native speaker standards, especially when speaking, and raising critical awareness about the coloniality of English. And this one is quite important because a lot of students don't really, they accept English as a prestigious language, and this should be confronted, this should be questioned. And at the higher level, at elite universities in India, it is. They study the colonial legacy of the English language, and but in some of the lower level colleges, they don't, and even the teachers don't have this awareness, but I believe that it's important. Okay, I want to make sure there's some time for questions. So I'm going to skip this part. Oh, and I do want to share this. This is the last kind of thing that Layla told me. Layla reflected on our interview. She said, actually, I enjoyed this interview personally because I faced a lot of problems, a lot of disadvantages and advantages using this language. I love to speak about this. So just to demonstrate that they were really interested in discussing these issues, which I was really happy about. As far as my contribution to the scholarship, I found that I was kind of challenging the binary code of the haves and the have-nots, because a lot of the students, they felt in between. So it was, so English can be both hegemonic, like colonial, but it can also be emancipatory at the same time. It was what my supervisor said, a rare excursion into the lives of an in-between group. So in a post-colonial peripheral setting, where they were fighting with this, what the complex tensions that English brings. and the capability and decolonial framing of prestige, fear, gender as language learning barriers. Okay, maybe I'll skip limitations and recommendations for research. If you want the slides, I can give them to you. I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. So thank you for your time.
It's a very interesting presentation. We don't have time for a buzz, but feel free to ask a question or, share just your reflections. Yes, Amira?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say that I studied in English in India. So I got my master's on feminism and Dalit women. And I compared South Asian women with Central Asian women's traditions. So I mean, I really relate to whatever you've been telling, but somehow I didn't publish because I didn't find myself fit to consider myself insider being a woman and just writing about those women. So my question is that, do you see any overlaps between colonial English language in India and Russian Soviet colonial language in Central Asia? I mean, the language between English and Russian, because still Russian is kind of perceived as a prestigious language in Central Asia, though we are trying to link from Sovietization or whatever, that's the question. And also, just a feedback, I was viewing the decolonizing English in a different way. For example, I'm engaged in gender studies in Central Asia under the supervision of Nuri. And when I read your topic, yes. So I thought that decolonizing English is about the opportunity to contribute for non-English speaking backgrounds. As for example, we're trying to produce knowledge and to counter the Western narratives, but still being able to produce the text in English. So in that way, I was viewing the decolonizing English. So can you answer the question about the Russian language overlaps with English in India?
Yeah, the way I understand it, Russian occupies a slightly different position here. It's much more frequently used in everyday communication, just from my observation. Many more people are fluent in Russian or use Russian than use English in India. English is spoken by a relatively small number of people to any fluency, whereas especially in Kazakhstan, Russian is quite well established and used in everyday communication. It's used as a social language here as well. English is really a study language, a library language, it's often called, so it's positioned a bit differently. They're both colonial legacy languages. I think Russian is more powerful here, and it's more diluted into the population. In English in India provides more opportunities, especially if you are fluent or proficient. So, yeah.
I mean, someone from the Indian subcontinent, how Central Asian people had access to Russian language is very different than what proportion of people had access to English language even when India was part of the British colony. Basically, a small elite group of people who were acting as intermediary between the British colonial regime and the local masses. So I would say although both are colonial languages, it's very different than people's access to Russian language in Central Asian countries, and what proportion of Indians or who were the Indians who had access to English language.
Yeah, English was actually never imposed in India. It was kind of, they were careful not to impose it too much. They didn't want the unified Indian state to kind of, it's complicated, but it's much, And your second question is really interesting.
So we have two questions. Let's take the questions, both of them, and then you can answer. Anita?
I'm probably the only insider. As a female Indian growing up in southern India, going to a not so good English medium school, I understand. First of all, I just want to thank you for giving voices to these. Thank you for choosing women. To me, that is significant because I was part of this population and I don't think anybody came to me to ask me about what I thought about English. But I really wanted to point out the narrative, the slide with the student narrative that you had. if you could just bring that up really quickly. One of the things that probably people need to understand about India is, for us, language is a political, it's very, very deeply political. One of the reasons we picked English is actually in that student narrative where she says, see, we're not allowed to speak in Hindi, especially those of us in the South. That's her first. I started learning English when I was 4 or 5 years old in my play school, as talking in Hindi was not allowed. So for us, especially in the South, we have more of an anti-Hindi sentiment than an anti-English sentiment. So we steered towards English, not because
To
it
oppose
was a
Hindi.
colonial language. We never looked at it that way. But this was much stronger, so we kind of veered towards English.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
it was really nice to see that in a way. Sad that it's still the case.
Yeah.
You know, I went to school in the 80s and 90s, but this is
Yeah.
2017.
Yeah. Especially Tamil Nadu, the resistance against Hindi is very strong. In Andhra Pradesh, not as much, but still Hindi is not spoken locally, not very much.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think some of the students came from families where Hindi was spoken, they came from different.
Yeah, especially in Andhra, they speak more Hindi than
Yeah.
we do.
Yeah.
South.
You're from
But,
Tamil Nadu.
yes.
There's a question here, Tom, yeah.
Well, I wanted to
Can
ask
you please
about,
introduce yourself?
I am Dana, I'm a researcher at CARCEIT. I also did my bachelor in Hindi language and I studied in India. So when I also did my bachelor thesis on topic of national languages of India after the independence years. So one of the things that in India, most of the states, they don't speak Hindi, you know, like they speak different languages and there are like more than 200 dialects. And English is like one of the languages that you can communicate. I think this is also like beneficial to learn English.
Yeah, it's really a kind of a lingua franca, especially in the South, Hindi in the North. But yeah, English kind of, again, it's the language of prestige. It's more prestigious than Hindi in all parts of India, but it's less spoken overall than Hindi. So it's complex and it's a huge mix of languages. It's a very multilingual region of the world. Yeah, thank you.
If there is no other question, I'll just share my observation with you when you were presenting how the girls are talking to you. They call you sir, yeah, and it kinds of establish both that social hierarchy, but also the gender hierarchy. And I'm interested a bit more, probably, we still have time, in how those gender and your social positioning as a teacher played out in your interactions with your participants.
Yeah, well, I was very kind of, I had to really reflect on how I was going to position myself as a male researcher. And it worked. I wanted to make sure, first of all, that we had a space that was, I let them choose the space if they wanted to, or I had an office available to me, which had a glass door, where, and I think the relationship building was the most important thing. They knew me, I knew them, we had, so getting to know the participants is really, really important, and just having goodwill. And I also helped them out with, and some of them were applying for degrees or jobs, and I was helping them with their CV. So I didn't want to just extract data from them. I helped them in with their whatever they wanted help with. So I just tried to bring those power dynamics as close as possible. Of course, there's still a huge power distance. Yeah, I mean, I keep in touch with some of them. They still write me WhatsApp messages. So I just maintain a good friendly relationship, kind of as an outsider, but as a friendly outsider and conscious of their needs and their position as well as mine. So yeah, I just took a constant kind of, a real reflexivity.
So in conservative societies like, I mean, I've never been to India, but I guess there are quite a lot of similarities. So for example, in Pakistan, if women would want to access male-only spaces, they would encounter challenges, yeah? Not physical challenges of not being allowed, but how people interact with them and the level of openness they might feel comfortable disclosing themselves. But if this woman is, for example, a white woman, the situation will be totally different because they can treat a white woman as an honorary male, yeah? So even though the gender is female, they will still accord her a different status. And I was wondering here that gender hierarchy is upside down in the sense that we are talking about female only spaces and you as a male researcher. So what were the advantages for you in the space?
Yeah, there were some male lecturers as well, not only female, but all the students were female. So it wasn't unusual. I wasn't the only male on campus, so they had some male lecturers. I was connected to my wife who was teaching there, so I was legitimized basically just as a presence on campus and doing all the stuff I said, helping with the campus clean campus.
The right male.
So I was kind of made an honorary
Yeah.
guest on campus, and I was welcome. Yeah, so it was okay. It was it was like that. It was
that gave you legitimacy, yeah.
And of course, I approached the management of the college to make sure it was all of that.
I was really surprised that India also has women-only colleges because we have in Pakistan
It was actually
female schools with only female teachers, female colleges, female universities, and I'm really surprised.
It was actually a Christian-linked college, but some of the students were from all religious backgrounds.
Yeah, yes. Question. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. Really interesting. And about methodology. So you said about dialogic interviews and then narratives and then arts-based. Yes. So these photo voices. How did you?
I didn't do photo voice. I used pictures as kind of.
So that was one of the examples. That you showed.
Yeah. I showed them the gods of English, and I talked about
your own pictures that you took.
No, I didn't really fit with. No, it was. I showed them different pictures related to English in their community. And I
analyzed
basically it was kind of this bit of a strategic move to have the computer with the picture there as a third thing, but it wasn't just us two together, but here, let's look at this screen. And so that helped to kind of diffuse me as a man and a young woman there. So
to facilitate
the discussion, that sort of interaction. It was that was part of it, and they had something to reflect on, as well as the vignettes where we were talking about a third person, a friend or somebody, rather than, okay, are your parents going to force you to get married, or it's more like talking about friends and things like that. So
Thanks, Jessica. 30-second question on that. It was a fascinating presentation. I see a lot of parallels here in Ukraine, in my own positionality as an outsider who became an insider. But my question is about your data collection, because the examples that you have presented are all in English.
yes.
Were all of the data collected only in English, or was there translanguaging by the participants when you?
No, I don't speak the local languages. I've never been to this part. I didn't choose the place. It was my wife happened to get work there. So no, all the data was collected in English. So I didn't go through my limitations, but I got speakers who were above average in English, and the stories of some of those who struggled were filtered through the more fluent friends. So I leave it to local researchers to gather data with in local languages. But I decided not to use an interpreter because it wouldn't have allowed for the deep kind of interactive dialogue, basically.
It's still very rich data.
It is, yeah.
Clearly it speaks. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that you acknowledge that as a limitation.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tom.